So welcome everybody to this really exciting talk. I've been very looking forward to this webinar, whale shark tagging by Dr. Mark Erdmann of Conservation International. So welcome to that. Before we start, just want to say a couple words about Insider Divers. So we organize group trips for scuba diving and snorkeling. We do land-based and liveaboard scuba diving, but we also do specific trips, for example, rec trips or tech trips, as well as free diving trips, for example, with whales. And we do photography workshops. So we do all kinds of different dive formats, as well as pointing out in this stage that all of our trips are group trips, so we don't really do individual travel, and there always is at least one expert, a scientist, a photographer like myself, or a coach of some sort, a tech instructor, somebody like that will always be on your trip, at least one, maybe two, and they will make sure that your itinerary is very unique, something that is harder to experience by yourself, and that's why we set it up like that. On all of our trips, we also really focus on education and coaching. So when we do a trip with whale sharks, for example, then we will talk a lot about whale shark biology, behavior, conservation, etc. And because we're all not diving, during this period, I started setting up these webinars, and I called it Insider Academy for lack of a better word, because, you know, even though we're not diving, we want to keep thinking and learning about the scuba diving. Just for those who are maybe dialing in for the first time or one of the earlier times, I've put all of the different webinars, which is almost 30 webinars by now, on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/insiderdivers, and there's everything on there. We've got really cool things about sharks and manta rays, different photography topics, lots and lots of guest speakers, such as Mark, who's here today. And if you are interested, you can look at those at any time you like. You can even download them if you like. And yeah, have a look, follow that channel to see the updates. If you're using Zoom for the first time, I think in this day and age, with all the COVID, everybody's used to it now, but I'm just going to quickly say it. Your audio and video is turned off. That just makes it easier to communicate with, you know, a larger audience. There's a Q&A option and a chat. So if you look into your options there in your panel, you have a Q&A and a chat. And if you just have comments or you want to point something out that's not a question, please put it into the webinar chat. And if you have an actual question that you would like to ask Dr. Erdmann or Mark, just put it into the Q&A. I'm going to be managing all the questions, so Mark can concentrate on giving us a super nice talk. And I will organize the questions as well. So some questions I'll pick to maybe interrupt him and ask the question right there when he's on the topic, and others I'll save for the end. So if you put them in the Q&A, would be the easiest for me. So that would be great if you could do that. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Mark. Mark, are you there?
I am indeed. Hi, Simon.
There he is. Welcome, welcome. Dialing in from New Zealand.
Yep.
How are you? Good?
I'm all good. How about you?
Yeah, not too bad. I've been diving all day. I think you've been more like snowboarding, haven't you?
Snowboarding is another 2 days. I've actually been diving a fair bit as well, although it's 10 degrees Celsius here, so
Oh,
a little chillier here in the winter.
what are you researching something?
I was actually doing a fair bit of white shark diving back in late May and early June, and then since that I've been doing more crayfish and abalone diving to fill the belly.
Oh, wow, okay. Subsistence fishing.
Exactly.
Great. Well, if you want to share your screen, you can start right off. Like I mentioned, I might like interrupt you if there's questions that are relevant right for the topic, and otherwise I'll save them for the end.
Okay, excellent.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Simon. Well, I'll go ahead and start. So again, as you're all aware, this talk is going to be about tagging whale sharks, really is the focus. And I would note that this is work which has been largely done in Indonesia with a big team of CI Indonesia scientists, which I list down there at the bottom. Oh no, am I going to be able to make this go forward? All right. So for the presentation, I will give you some fast facts on whale sharks. I'm sure some of you are already experts, but for those that aren't, I'll fill you in. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the whale shark Bagan interaction, and I'll explain that shortly, and the conservation research program that we have going in Indonesia, as well as a number of the results of this satellite tagging and some of the photo ID work. So you're probably aware the whale shark is known as Rhynchodon typus in terms of its scientific name. It was described all the way back in 1828 from Cape Town. And it is the world's largest fish. So not just the largest shark, but actually the world's largest fish, up to 18 meters in total length and 34 tons. So they're a big animal, even though most people never see them anywhere near as big as that. They are found circumglobally in tropical and temperate seas. So they're not just a tropical phenomenon by any means. We do have them here in New Zealand. They're up in Taiwan. We get them in Hong Kong. They're known to aggregate seasonally in certain tropical seas. So Belize, Galapagos, Sea of Cortez, Isla Mujeres, Ningaloo in Western Australia, Christmas Island, the Andaman Seas, Seychelles, Maldives, Donsol, and CENDERAWASIH, to name a few of those areas where they are typically dived to see when they're aggregating. They feed predominantly on planktonic crustaceans and schools of small bait fish. So these are, although they're the world's largest shark, world's largest fish, they do not have big teeth. They have tiny teeth, and they use a suction filter feeding mechanism to bring in this plankton or small schools of fish. They frequently go into a tail stand posture while they're feeding, and they suck in these large aggregations of bait fish. And I will try to show you that here in a second. Having trouble advancing. Okay, there you can see one, that quite the suction going on there. Another big suction. And here I'll just show you, if I can make this play, in Cendrawasih Bay in West Papua. Whoops, that didn't work. Here we go. You can see the suction ability that they have, and they actually are able to figure out how to suck the fish out of the net. So rascally sharks stealing the fish out of the fishermen's nets. But you can see just what an amazing suction they have when they're doing it. Okay. Interestingly, despite the fact that these are the world's largest fish, world's largest sharks, there's very little which is known about them. We do know that they can migrate long distances. They can go thousands of kilometers, roughly 10 to 100 kilometers a day. We know that they can dive very deeply, over 1,800 meters. And of course, despite the name whale shark, they are very much a shark and not a whale. So they don't need to breathe. They don't ever need to come to the surface. They could spend hours, weeks, months without ever coming to the surface if they wanted to. Interestingly, the females are very rarely encountered. And most of the aggregations where people would go to see them diving wise are all juvenile or young adult males, or predominantly so. In the 4 to 9 meter length. And I would note, it's an interesting point there, juvenile males, 8 meters. An 8 meter whale shark, I can assure you, is a very large thing to see underwater, but those are actually still juveniles. They're not yet even adults. And interestingly, there's almost nothing known about their mating and birthing. What we do know about their reproduction, they reach sexual maturity somewhere between 7 and 9 meters. That's at the age of 10 to 30 years. So they're quite old by the time that they're adult. There is basically, we know this from one pregnant female that was captured in Taiwan. She was butchered, and inside her uterus, she had 300 fetuses. If you know anything about shark reproduction, that's not a usual situation. Most of the sharks that you would think of might be giving birth to, you know, a litter of 5 to 12 animals at a time. But this female, a big female, had 300 babies in her uterus. So this suggests that whale sharks are a little bit different than most other sharks that way. We know that they're born at about 60 centimeters in length and about 1 kilogram in weight. And we know that they can reach about 1.4 meters and 20 kilograms in only 4 months. That's known from some babies that were actually spontaneously aborted from a female that was harpooned in the Philippines, and the babies were taken into an aquarium in Japan, and they had that that type of weight gain in just
Can
4 months.
I ask a question, Mark?
Of course.
What's your personal theory on what they do between birth and 3 meters?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, you know, what I can say with relative confidence is that we're pretty sure that they're not hanging out in the places where divers normally are, because otherwise we obviously would be seeing them. So they're probably not in shallow tropical reef type environments. That said, I would note I have had one really amazing experience in West Papua in the Kaimana area, where I had a 2 meter female that followed me about on the reef for about an hour. That was a really unique experience. Normally we don't see them, as you say, really below 3 meters. But where those real babies are, you know, either they're out far at sea, far away from where divers and any ships are seeing them, or they're simply down deeper. And we think that that's probably the case for the vast majority of the bigger animals as well. Because as I said, most of the places where divers see them, you're not seeing 18-meter whale sharks, you're seeing maybe 8 or 9 meters at max. So again, a lot we don't really know, but you'll see when I start showing you some of the satellite tag data, they certainly can go into far away places and very deep. So I have a feeling that's what we're seeing there. Yeah, so that's the situation there. Here, interestingly enough, is a photo I thought was quite interesting from the Texas coastline back in 1955. Now remember, they are live bearers, so they give birth to their young, but within the uterus, they actually have egg cases originally, and then they hatch out in the uterus, grow bigger, and then they eventually are born. So that's a little baby curled up in a not yet hatched egg case. Whale shark tourism, of course, is a multi-million-dollar industry around the world. It tends to be very seasonal. So in Belize, it's only 6 weeks of the year when the whale sharks are there feeding on snapper spawn, but it raises quite a bit of money, of course, for the industry at that time. And you can see that around a number of these areas. In Indonesia, I'm not aware of any really robust estimates yet, but it certainly would be a fair bit of money at this point as well. In terms of predators, there's only, once these animals get to be 3 or 4 meters in length, there's only a few natural predators that they would have, basically some of the larger sharks, such as tigers and possibly white sharks in some areas, and orcas, possibly false killer whales as well. But they are nonetheless now considered endangered around the world due to humans, of course, both from the perspective of targeted fisheries. You know, in Taiwan, they were known for quite some time as a delicacy, tofu shark. They are now protected, I might add. In fact, most parts of the world they're now protected, but there were targeted fisheries to be sure. They are caught as bycatch occasionally, and then a more recent phenomenon that we're concerned about that we don't really know is the issue of microplastics. I mean, and I'm sure that a number of you are aware of that issue, and you could imagine if you've got an animal that big that's sucking as much water as it does to filter out plankton, it's probably pulling in a lot of microplastics as well. We don't know for sure what impact that might be having, but we can't really imagine it would be very good. So quick summary, whale sharks are cool, whale sharks are valuable, but endangered, and they're still very mysterious. There's a lot that we don't know about them. One other thing I'll just note out about them is that they have a unique pattern of spots and swirls on the side, which appears to last throughout their lifetime, from the time that they're babies until they're adults. And that allows us, this is much like a thumbprint or a fingerprint on a human, a unique pattern. So that allows us to compile these photo ID databases and track individuals over time. And indeed, that's how I was introduced to Simon. He was busy handing me over some of the photos he took from West Papua that we were putting into our database. Typically, what we're aiming for with those databases is to have a left-hand side shot That's just the standard. But if you happen to be out there photographing and you get a right-hand side shot, that's also very valuable. Most databases do also try to keep a right side, but the left is the standard. And so you get these databases which are compiled. There's quite a few regional ones and one global one, Wild Book for Whale Sharks, which anyone can go on and submit their data to. And that's a pretty powerful tool to basically track whale sharks over time and around places. So I mentioned earlier that I'm going to talk a little bit.
I'm just going to ask one question so
Yep.
you can include it when you go to this next part.
Yep.
Sarah is asking, I should have asked that earlier, if the vertical feeding also happens naturally or only around these bagans. So maybe you can just build
Absolutely.
that in.
So they 100% do that tail stand posture on a natural basis as well. It's not just the Bagan, which I'm about to show you. This is something which you will see in a number of places. I've actually seen it in CENDERAWASIH numerous times when I've gotten in on a big baitfish school, and you'll see them doing that tail stand posture. Quite similar to the way that a lot of the bigger whales which feed on them come up through the water column as well.
I've seen it in Mexico
Yeah.
off Cancun,
Yeah.
and they would call it botellón, which is like the floating bottle essentially. And whenever there's enough fish, they would get up in this vertical, and you can swim around them. They just do not care, and all they do is
Exactly. Yeah, so I mentioned I'm going to talk about this Bagan interaction, and there you can see a drone shot of a Bagan with a couple of whale sharks around it. What is a Bagan? Well, a Bagan is a lift net vessel that targets bait fish, typically clupeids and atherinids, kind of little sardini-like animals, as well as squid, and they aggregate them at night using lights. And they have a large bag net, which is suspended below the Bagan, and it's raised every 3 to 4 hours. So you can see there it is as twilight hits. They've just turned on their lights, so they're about to put down their net, and then they'll lower that, and as the fish gather around underneath the lights, they'll pull it up and catch everything. They typically do this about 3 times an evening. Now, there's an interaction that's going on now between Bagans and whale sharks. We first recorded this in CENDERAWASIH Bay in West Papua back in 2006. And the whale sharks have been, I should note, have been known to be targeting these bait fish in CENDERAWASIH since at least the 1930s, as long as the oldest fishermen can remember back when they were first children. But they've had to compete with these Bagans since 2003, when the Bagans first got to the bay. And so what you've got is basically, it's a competition situation really, but it's evolved into something a little bit more interesting. And so what you typically find is in the morning, the Bagan fishers will toss in a couple kilograms of bait fish to the whale sharks just to keep them around for a while. And the reason they're doing that is because in addition to fishing for little fish, the fishermen on the Bagan also do hand lining for tuna, mackerel, swordfish, and other things. And they believe very strongly that whale sharks are good luck, and that if you have whale sharks around under your Bagan, you're likely to have other big fish. And I would say that anecdotally, I would agree based on many, many hours under the Bagans. So there you can see. Yep, go ahead.
So is it they still do that, or do they just do it? So they throw in the fish even when there's no tourists around?
Absolutely. So that's how the whole thing came about in terms of the tourists getting to know this. Was basically they do this in all around Indonesia, where there's Bagans and whale sharks coming together. Irrespective of whether there's tourists, they will throw the bait fish in. They won't throw them in until midday. You know, if you do it with a tourism situation, typically you rent the Bagan for the morning, and they basically throw all of their catch back in to bring in a lot of sharks. But what they will do, irrespective, no tourists around, is they will throw in a couple kilograms and just to keep the whale sharks around so that they have better hand lining. So kind of an interesting little point there. So there you can see the whale sharks coming up at night. There they are in the morning, the bait fish, and the guys will just literally hand feed them like puppies. And so what you get then is a situation where, you know, I don't know if you can see there in the middle of the screen, the folks watching there, but there's a whale shark basically eating right out of the bait bucket, and then in comes another one, and you'll see, I mean, this is, it's an interesting situation. I mean, it's definitely not natural, but it creates an interesting situation, certainly for science and for tagging, which I'll get back to in a second, and as well as for being able to interact with them in the water. So, and we can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's maybe we'll leave that for questions at the end. The important point, though, is that we know of at least all of the areas which I put the stars here where that interaction is happening. Many of those, there are no tourists visiting at all. It's just something which is kind of evolved between the Bagan fishermen and the whale sharks. The areas which have the red in the stars are ones where CI, Conservation International, has been doing work. So we've been doing a conservation research initiative since 2009 in West Papua, CENDERAWASIH Bay, Raja Ampat, Fakfak, and Kaimana. And then in 2017, we began in Sumbawa, SALEH Bay. And the focus is really to provide high quality data to the Indonesian government about these whale shark movements and natural history in order to inform marine park management and tourism management. And again, these are our main areas: CENDERAWASIH Bay, TRITON Bay, and SALEH Bay, with a little bit going on in Raja Ampat and Fakfak there. So with the West Papua whale sharks, we've been collecting data since 2009. We now have 202 individuals in our database from 652 different sightings, some of them being Simons. Only 6% of those sightings, or 6% of those individuals, I should say, are female. So that gives you an idea of just how male biased these aggregations are, typically when you have the younger juveniles. Total length of these animals ranges from 2.2, the female that I said I had this amazing interaction with, on up to 7.8 meters. We have a mean of 4.7 meters for males, and well, 4.7 for both males and females. We have a 51% resighting rate, so quite a few of them do get seen more than once, and 14 of those individuals have been observed for more than 5 years now. And I'll just show you a bit of that data. Again, there's the size frequency distribution, which you can see the upper bits are the males and the green ones are the females, very few of those around. But you can see, again, it's predominantly animals in that 4 to 5 meter range. In terms of resighting frequency, you can see that 98 of our 202 sharks have only been seen once, but up at the top there, 10 of them have been seen more than 10 times, 26 have been viewed 6 to 10 times, etc. So they definitely are hanging out in West Papua, and we are seeing some. Here you can see the number of years they've been observed for. One animal we've had for 8 years in a row. We've been seeing him. Others 6 to 7 years, etc. So they definitely are hanging out, and we would anticipate. We don't see any of the adults. These are only up until the point when they're just turning into mature males, and then they seem to disappear. Our discovery curve looks like this, and what the point is there is that you know, as we add more sightings, we tend to add more individuals. So by no means have we gotten to the absolute number that are there. It just keeps going up each time that we add sightings. If I compare that to Sumbawa, which I showed down closer to Bali, we have 74 individuals in the database there. 11% of them are female, so a bit more, almost twice the opportunity to see them there. Similar size range, similar means, and again, 51% resighting rate. So similar type of situation. Now, I mentioned with the Bagans, the interesting thing is that they do frequently get caught in these Bagans. And that was particularly a big deal kind of in the 2013 to 2015 range in CENDERAWASIH. And it dawned on us that this was a really interesting opportunity to attach Finmount satellite tags, something which had never been done before with whale sharks. Finmount tags, for those of you who watch Discovery Channel or you know, a lot of these shark tagging shows, Finmount tags are very typically put onto a lot of the bigger sharks, the great white sharks, the tiger sharks, etc. There is a bit of controversy about them because a lot of times the fin mounts on those sharks seemed to cause a fin droopage. But fortunately with whale sharks, they have a very stout, big dorsal fin. But no one had ever managed to put a Finmount tag on them, basically because you can't catch a whale shark typically. But in this case, they were being caught. So it allowed us to do something quite unique and attach these tags to the dorsal fin. So we started doing this in 2015. And I'm going to show you there. You can see it is with its bling. And that satellite tag, you can see the antenna on the top there. Every time that that dorsal fin breaks the surface, that antenna is going to communicate with the Argos satellite network up above. And it's going to not only find its position on Earth, it's also going to send that data back. And we can actually look at that while we're sitting in our office. So some of these horizontal movements that we've been able to show, I'm going to give you a number of different maps here. This is all from that transmitted Argos data. We have individual tracks that are ranging from 250 on up to 888 days continuous off of one of our female sharks, actually. And just to give you an idea of what you're looking at here, the green circles represent positions at the beginning of the deployment. Red circles are at the end of the deployment, and the orange and yellow are kind of in between there. So this is one individual animal you're looking at here. In this case, I left the connecting lines in there because it's quite easy to see. Other places I have not put that in because it would be a little bit confusing to look at. So here's an example of a nearly 6-meter male that we tagged in CENDERAWASIH, and over the course of 2.5 years, it never left CENDERAWASIH. Just sat there. You might argue, well, we're just busy feeding from the Bagans. I can talk more about that later, but this is a typical type of track that we might get. And here's one which did a little bit more movement around the bay, but you can see really spending its time in CENDERAWASIH Bay. Now, you'll also note that there's some of those dots that are on land. That's not an amphibious shark. What that is that sometimes the Argos satellite positions that we get have a kind of plus or minus of 50 kilometers in terms of their accuracy. And in this case, you can see they're inaccurately being portrayed as being on land, but that obviously they were not on land. Now, those were some relatively boring tracks, but actually we've had a lot of them that show very interesting tracks. And here's a case of one Moby, a nearly 6-meter male, which did a very interesting, it stayed in CENDERAWASIH for a while, then it shot up into Palau waters all the way up to the Mariana Trench. While it was doing that, I might add, it dived to 1,859 meters, which was quite impressive. It was even more impressive to us because that was beyond the depth capacity of the tag, and it ended up busting its depth sensor by doing that. But the interesting thing is that it then came back down to CENDERAWASIH, and then at the same time the next year, where you can see that red dot with the white circle, it was on its way back up to Palau. And that's something which we've seen over and over again with these animals. Individuals do things that are very different. By no means does every whale shark do the same thing. They all have their own kind of individual pattern of movement. But what they do is they tend to repeat the same movements year after year, which is really quite interesting. And I'll show you more of those in a minute. Now, as a conservation organization, we're of course spending a lot of our time helping the government and communities set up big marine parks. And we have 21 of those marine parks around West Papua. That works very, very well, of course, for corals and fishes that don't move a whole lot, but for whale sharks that can move and go up to the Mariana Trench, you're kind of left going, well, how do we protect those? And really the best thing we can do is to try to make sure that we have marine parks wherever they're spending large periods of time. So from that perspective, it's been quite interesting to see what these whale shark tracks have shown us. And here's Fijubeca. It is a little 3-meter male. But he did a pretty impressive track there. And you can see, again, spending a lot of time in CENDERAWASIH Bay, which is a national park, then up into Palauan waters, over into PNG waters, over to Sulawesi, and then down into the region of Misol and Raja-Ampat and Fak-Fak, and even further down into the Arafura Sea. Now, what was interesting there, that tag went for about 672 days. Covered a 9,000 kilometer track, hit 4 countries. But importantly for us, it visited 8 of the marine parks that we have in West Papua. And it moreover highlighted 3 new areas where the whale sharks where that whale shark was spending a lot of time, which since that time we've been able to turn Fak into an MPA, covering one of those areas where the shark was spending a lot of time. Also, Mapia is in discussion with local communities right now. So simply by that data we're getting from the sharks, that's leading us to new areas to set up marine parks. This is an interesting one. Wally, a 6-meter male, absolute opposite situation from the one that went up, Moby, who went up to the Mariana Trench. This one is a coastline hugger, and you can see he spent his time mostly in CENDERAWASIH Bay, and then he went down into PNG, but he never left the coastline. He absolutely just hugged the coastline. The places where you see a number of dots are typically river outlets. Seems that he was feeding off of the river outlets, but just a real shallow water animal. And it repeated this pattern. Again, I don't show you the lines back and forth, but it repeated this pattern for 2.5 years of going down to the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea, back to CENDERAWASIH, and back and forth, which is pretty interesting to see. Here's Kodo, another male, 4 meters. This one also 4 countries, went up from CENDERAWASIH, went up into Palau waters over to Mindanao and the Philippines, then back down all the way into Australian waters. And the really interesting thing here for us is that if we see where all those red dots are, that's the area of Merauke, and that's a tidal mudflat. And this animal spent 4 months in water that was no deeper than 3 meters, and that was mostly intertidal mudflat, which is not where people tend to think that whale sharks would be spending time, but this one certainly did. Here's another one, which is perhaps more what people would think of a whale shark doing, heading out into the deep blue. This one, Cheggers, swam just along the surface all the way up to Chuk, 3,000 kilometers in 2 months. And you can see by the density of dots on the surface there, he was basically surface swimming the entire way, probably feeding along the way, I would imagine. And we have some ideas that might be on tuna spawn or something like that. Here's one that did even more impressive long distance motions. Alula, nearly 6-meter male, all the way out to the Marshall Islands, back to CENDERAWASIH Bay, then up to the Mariana Trench and back before that tag eventually ran out of battery. But 23,000 kilometers in 14 months, pretty darn impressive.
So after the battery is empty, does it fall off eventually, or the tag, or does it stay on?
So we've done a fair bit of work looking at that. Obviously, the optimal situation at the end of a battery life is that we're able to find the shark again and actually remove the tag, because the data which is stored on it is 10-second resolution data, and that's a real gold mine if we can do that. And we've actually managed to do that with nearly half of the sharks that we've tagged. But with some of them, of course, we don't manage to see them again after or at least not immediately thereafter. And what we found is that the tag, we have great evidence of this. I can show you some photos later if you'd like to see. The tags actually migrate out of the fin, and it takes about 3 years for that to happen. So they might be still kind of useless bling on the shark for about a year after the battery potentially dies, but then it's actually migrated out of the fin and it falls out. The shark's fin is basically completely healed. You have to look very, very closely to see that it actually ever had a tag in the first place. So we feel very confident that this is not hurting the animals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but definitely the tags come out on their own. We did experiment actually with using rusting screws in order that they would definitely fall out, but we've come to the conclusion now that we're actually better off using stainless screws so as to not have any rust around the animal's fin, and they come out by themselves anyway. So, okay. Here's Nexus, which this animal again.
I'm just curious about that.
Yeah.
So how do you get it off? Do you have to actually net the shark, or how do you get it off when he's swimming? I mean.
You can, well, not really when they're swimming, but if they are, again, having one of these Bagan interactions and they're busy feeding, as you said, you can pretty much go around a whale shark when they're feeding and they could not care less about you. So it's actually quite easy, if you've got the two special screwdriver tools, to unscrew it very quickly while they're feeding. I wouldn't want to be trying to do it while they were swimming at full speed, but when they're in a feeding situation, we can actually get it off without having to catch them. So,
And last question on that: when
yep.
you like I've seen videos of different animals getting tagged. Here, sometimes you will see that the animal will respond to it. Like an ear tag or something.
Yep.
When you're drilling holes, I think, right?
Yep.
So, what do you see, like body response of the shark? Do they feel it at all?
That's a very fair question, and I will cover a little bit about that at the end. But what I will simply say in terms of pain, the sharks don't actually have nerve endings in the dorsal fin, so they're definitely not feeling a pain from that perspective. But what I would say, it's kind of like a dentist chair, as you can imagine. And it's very clear when you're dealing with younger animals, smaller animals in the 3 to 4 meter range, that when the drill sound alone, definitely they know something is up that they're not necessarily happy about. But again, we do this when they've been caught in a net. And they typically kind of go into almost a tonic immobility at the bottom of the net. And when you do the drilling, which I know sounds barbaric, but again, as I said, they don't actually have nerve endings there. They'll wiggle a bit, but there's no real thing going on. And if you get to the bigger animals, 6, 7, 8 meters, they don't actually move at all. And that's, I might add, the same thing happens if you start doing tagging with spear guns of manta rays. Smaller reef mantas, absolutely, the minute that they get hit with a satellite tag, they're off in a heartbeat, whereas bigger oceanics turn around and look at you and kind of say, what was that just happened? A little flinch. And so it's a typical situation. But with these guys, I will come back to it because we've actually done some stress response blood testing on them, and I'll get to that in a second. Okay. Okay, those were all Cenderawasih Bay tracks. Here's one that was tagged in Triton Bay, Simon, where you've been. I think you've also been to Cenderawasih. But this one shows a pretty interesting pattern again, where almost every one of the sharks that we've tagged there, they stay in Triton Bay for the northwest monsoon, and then as soon as the southeast monsoon starts in May, June, they're out of there and they head down into the R4C towards Australia. Presumably they're feeding on something which is going on in the upwellings down there. And this animal did that repeatedly back and forth, including over to Timor-Leste and the Timor Gap. Here's another one. SPOCK did a similar thing during the northwest monsoon, kind of, October to March, April. They're hanging out in Kaimana and Triton Bay, and then they leave as soon as the southeast starts. And this one, its tag finally died. It was over near Wakatobi in the Banda Sea. So those were just a few of the Kaimana sharks. And here are a few that I'm going to show you from Sumbawa, from SALEH Bay, an area which is actually quite close to Bali in Lombok. This is an animal, 6.2 meter male, nearly 800-day track. It never left SALEH Bay. So just hanging out there. Again, you have the dots that look like it went on land. I assure you it didn't. But it did dive almost every single day to 350 meters, which is the bottom of the bay. Now here's an interesting one. GITT, nearly 5 meter male, nearly 860 days there, long track. This animal, again, spent most of its time in SALEH Bay, but every December, for 3 Decembers in a row, it would go out to Takabonerate in the Flores Sea, hang out for 2 months, presumably feeding, and then go back to SALEH Bay. And again, this is just this thing that we keep seeing over and over again. Each animal does its own thing, but it tends to repeat the same thing year after year. This is one of the few females that we've managed to tag, Blueberry, 5.2 meter female. She has the longest track we've ever had, 888 days, a very auspicious number. But she spent almost all her time in Saleh Bay, but then she had one excursion out into the Flora Sea, and then one most recently here kind of in December, January, February into March, where she went down across the Java Trench down towards Australia and was clearly feeding on the surface, we think on tuna spawn. And I'll point that out here in a second. Here's another one that we recently only tagged in October of last year, Batuta, a male. Similar to blueberry, went out into the Flores and Banda Sea, but then down across the Java Trench to feed, and is still there, actually. And the timing of that surface feeding in the water down there, it's a very open ocean type of environment there, perfectly coincides with the southern bluefin tuna spawning season, which is kind of September until May. So it seems like that's probably what these whale sharks are doing, is they're going down into that area between Sumbawa and Australia to feed on the tuna spawn. Here's yet another one, Uga, a big 8-meter male, went down into that tuna spawn area after 21 months of not leaving Saleh Bay, went down there, had a feed, and then eventually just started headed out towards Christmas Island. And this is an interesting area, of course, of interaction with some of those whale sharks, which of course are well known from Ningaloo in Western Australia. And this is the last track I'm going to show you, Woolcott, 5.1 meter male. This one covered 8,300 kilometers in the first 8 months, so down to that tuna spawning area. And then right now, he has headed over, hung out off of Darwin in Australia, then over to Merauke in Papua, and now in Arnhem Land in the Gulf of Carpentaria. So never seen that before, but a pretty interesting track nonetheless. So all of these tracks, I might add, you can see on a website here, or a CI website for whale sharks. It's kind of fun to watch where they go. So a quick summary of our Finmount tagging. We put out 57 of these tags since June 2015. 13 of them are still active. Track durations up to 888 days. Track distances up to 23,000 kilometers. 30 of those sharks we have for over 400 days, 14 of them for more than 700 days. So these are really the longest whale shark tracks that have ever been recorded. Highly individual movement patterns, but they're often repeated annually, and frequent dives below 1,000 kilometers, which are 1,000 meters, and up to 1,889 meters is the deepest dive that we've recorded. I will show you just a few quick ones of some of the depth data that we've gotten from sharks where we pulled the tags off and downloaded. Here you get this 10-second resolution data showing kind of what their diving behavior is. And it's very common that although they spend the vast majority of their time on the surface, they do almost daily dives to 300, 400 meters, sometimes as deep again as 1,900 meters. And we think that they might actually be doing those for air conditioning. But this is just to show you that about 70% of their time is spent in the top 25 meters. And in quite warm water, 28 to 31 C. As I noted, they happily live in quite colder water like New Zealand. So we think that when they're hanging out in the tropics like this, and they're a very well insulated animal, they're actually probably overheating. And so it seems that that might be what they're doing with this deep diving that they do each day, is just simply go down and have an air conditioning. Cool off time.
That would be that's the common theory now why they dive deep. So it's not a feeding behavior.
Well, if you look at this, I mean, this isn't a high resolution. I could give you much more, but you'll see these are bounce dives. They literally glide down to a certain depth and then they swim right back up to the surface. So you would presume that if they were actually feeding down there, they would go down. It would be more of a U shape. They'd get down there, they'd swim around at depth for a while and then come back up. But it's very much just, it's a bounce dive, literally. So that's one of the reasons why we think that it's a cooling kind of thing.
I heard a theory once that it's like maybe an orientation task, like that, like gets them maybe a magnetic bearing or something.
Sure, that certainly makes a lot of sense when you look at animals which are moving longer distances. The idea being that they dive down to get closer to the sea floor, where they could pick up a magnetic field and be able to orient perhaps across these, you know, the blue blue desert, so to speak. The thing is, though, that we get this happening when the animals are just hanging out in bays like CENDERAWASIH or SALEH Bay for years at a time. They're not going anywhere, but they're still going up and down. So I have a feeling that it's a combination of some of these different things, and maybe they're feeding as well. But there's also been a fair bit of work done looking at the stable isotopes of the food, and it looks like a lot of them are really focused on surface foods. So
anyway, one more question.
Oh, yeah.
That's also coming from but I also had the same question. Charlotte's also asking that. So what's your theory on how, like, why do some whale sharks do this kind of route and the others do that? I mean, we can see that some are repeating, some are not, right?
Yep.
What's your theory, or is there already some sort of theory that is shared amongst scientists?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to give you anything overwhelming, but what I'm simply going to say is that the more that satellite tracking is being used on a number of these different megafaunas, not just whale sharks, but also manta rays and white sharks and tiger sharks and mako sharks and etc. We tend to see this same exact thing. Like, we might think that they're just, you know, automatons that swim around in schools and they just, you know, follow their instincts. But what's really interesting is that they're actually very individual. And who knows why one decided at some, what we kind of think is that there, for some reason, a given individual just gets a wanderlust and decides, I'm going to warmer water, or I'm going over there in search of food. And if they're successful at that, that tends to imprint on their brain, and then they just keep doing it year after year after year. And again, when I look at the tagging data out of New Zealand, many of our animals here, whether it's whales, white sharks, mako sharks, mantas, etc., they actually all tend to head north for the winter. So they're looking for warmer water at that time. But the tracks that they use to do that are very individual. And again, they repeat it year after year. So it's something which we just see with so many of these animals. You know, we shouldn't be thinking that they're just, you know, kind of blindly following instinct. There's definitely some learning and culture and other things going on there as well, which is kind of cool when you look at it. At any rate, we've deployed 57 of these tags so far. We're planning to deploy some more advanced tags now with accelerometers and critter cams. In particular, my colleague Abraham Sianipar from Indonesia is going to be doing his master's and PhD on this. So there'll be some interesting data coming out of that, I think. And there's Abam right there, busy drawing blood. We did this in association with the Georgia Aquarium, which has got people who have quite an expertise in whale shark blood. And what we were interested to see is that if we do this whale shark, the Finmount tagging, doing blood draws before the drilling, before the fin mounting, and then after, and looking for signs of, you know, increased adrenaline and various other stress hormones in the blood. And what I can say with absolute authority now is that we had zero indication of any stress levels going up in the shark's blood during the course of the tagging operation. So we're quite happy with that. It was something we were concerned about, but this has largely proven it for us that that's not an issue. So yeah, I think I'll just end here with a couple of nice photos from West Papua with the whale sharks there. And at that point, we can do any further questions you have, Simon. And if you want me to, I can talk a bit about walking sharks too, go to the other end of the spectrum in terms of shark size. But if we're out of time, I can do that another time too. So anyway.
I definitely want to hear you talk a bit about walking sharks, but we still got a couple, you know, quite technical questions about the whale shark tagging.
Okay.
So one question is, and I don't know what that actually is, PTAT. So is the Finmount satellite tag the same with PTAT? PAT, sorry, PAT.
Right. So Typically, when people talk about satellite tags, there's numerous different types of satellite tags, but the most common, I suppose, is typically known as a PSAT or PAT, a pop-off satellite archival tag. And what's happening there is that the tag is archival, it's storing data, and then at a certain point, it pops off of the animal, and I'll get into that, but with these, because they're fin mounted and they're bolted to the animal, again, there's no popping off here. These are absolutely bolted into the fin, and we either have to take the tag off or it has to migrate out of the back of the fin, which, as I said, typically takes about 3 years for it to do. They are transmitting. So again, this is a difference with most of those pop-off archival tags, is that they're storing data until the end of the deployment, which is user-defined, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. You don't hear anything until the tag pops off, and then it spews all of its data to the satellites, and then suddenly you find something out. With these tags, every time the animal's on the surface, we're getting a signal. So you can actually track these animals more in real time, which is a quite interesting aspect to them. So they are different from PAT tags, I guess, is the answer.
And how much does one of these tags cost?
These tags cost about $3,500 US. So they're not cheap, but actually only about half as expensive as some of the more expensive satellite tags. So and these, I might add, were custom made for us by Wildlife Computers with the very big batteries to be able to go 2 years plus. And we felt we could do that because the whale sharks' dorsal fins are so stout that they could really handle a bigger tag, and they've done that quite nicely.
And when you have like a really long line on your map, is that really no surface, like a long swim, or might it just be where it didn't record for once? I mean, there are some are pretty extreme, like jumps, right?
Sure. So, normally the way we would interpret that, if you've got a long space in between dots on the surface, is that the animal was underwater that entire time. And you don't know, it might have been only a meter underwater, it might have been at 1,000 meters underwater. It is possible, however, that it was on the surface and that it just didn't transmit. That can happen if it in a very big wave type of situation. So if it's stormy or just an area with really rough seas, sometimes it won't transmit so well when they're on the surface. But again, these tags, because they have such a long antenna, we really don't have a problem with that the way that you do with a number of the other animals. These are very, very, very reliable transmitters. We hear from them almost daily. So.
Okay. I've got here a question from the Mataram University of Indonesia, very specific, asking if you have any tips on tagging a smaller animal, like less than 1.5 meters, for example, juvenile shark. Also in terms of injuries, I suppose, also growth impairment or whatever. Do you have any experience in that?
Right. Our tagging situation in CI Indonesia has largely focused on manta rays and whale sharks. More recently, we've been helping a young man, Rafid Shidki, with the Indonesia Thresher Shark Project, doing some of his satellite tagging on thresher sharks, which are typically more kind of in the 1.5 to 1.8 meter range. For that, I would say this type of tagging, in my opinion, would not really be appropriate, because we know even with big sharks like white sharks and tiger sharks, this type of tagging has the potential to actually damage the dorsal fin. Whale sharks fortunately have, again, this very stout fin, they can handle it, but I wouldn't, for a typical reef shark, if you were thinking black-tipped reef sharks or white tips or something like that, or threshers, any of the smaller sharks, I personally would not go for a fin mount type of tag, because I just think that it's probably not fair to the animal, and over time would probably damage the fin. In that case, typically people would be using these PAT tags, and those would typically be applied usually with a pole spear and a titanium dart tip that goes in just below the the dorsal fin. And again, those typically would be for deployments of, on average, probably 6 months at a time. And that's a very well-developed technology. If you look on the Wildlife Computers website, you would find out plenty about that. Alternatively, if you're in Indonesia, you could contact Abraham Sianipar at Conservation International, and he has a lot of experience with this, and he'd probably be able to help as well, I'd say.
Great. I'm going to ask you a difficult one. You know which one it is. Having written articles about shark feeding myself, I know it's a difficult one. But what do you think personally about the Bagan tourism? And also, do you think that the whale shark's natural behavior is affected? Anything you want to share about that? I know it's a bit of a minefield, that one, but I'm sure you're skilled in answering it.
Yeah. Well, you know, honestly, the Bagan interaction has been very beneficial for our team to be able to do some of this tagging, which again has never been done anywhere else. So from that perspective, I would say it's had a benefit from a science perspective. But overall, I think, you know, I'm not, quite frankly, I'm not a huge fan of the feeding which happens. I generally don't think that feeding marine life is a good idea. That's my personal belief. But of course, it has created quite an interesting economy there. What we have been kind of interested in doing, actually, though, is that I will note that there's a deeper socioeconomic situation here, which actually goes beyond the sharks, and that is that in most of the places in West Papua where the Bagans are, the people that are actually fishing with the Bagans are not locals. They're not from Papua, and the Papuans, quite frankly, are typically not actually that happy with the Bagans there, because the Bagans, of course, are fishing these bait fish, which anyone with a bit of an ecological knowledge knows that that's kind of the base of the food chain there, and that the fishes that the Papuans typically want to eat, which could be the skipjack tuna, the chikalang, the tingiri, the various and other mackerels and things, they're feeding on the bait fish too. And so if the Bagans are busy taking out all of the bait fish, you're in a situation where it's maybe not the best situation. So many of the Papuan communities that we work with don't actually want the Bagans in their area. So in Raja Ampat, as an example, most of the marine parks don't allow the Bagans in them at all. So we have that added little bit of intrigue, if you will, that the Papuans don't even want the Bagans there in the first place. So what we've been looking at trying to do, because it is, of course, an interesting socioeconomic, or there is a strong economic value to this. If there was a way of, instead of actually having nets going down and catching the bait fish, if instead you could just simply aggregate the bait fish with perhaps a floating platform that had the lights out every night, and the sharks got accustomed to coming there and they could feed naturally on the aggregated fish, that seems like a much better type of situation. And it's something that we've been speaking with a number of the communities, both in CENDERAWASIH and Triton Bay, about trying to do that. So basically setting up Bagans without nets that attract the fish in, then would attract the whale sharks in. There's no fishing actually going on, and no direct feeding. The whale sharks would just do what they normally do, which is to feed on the bait fish. So that's what we would probably prefer to see. But your question about, is it altering their behavior? To be sure, in a certain sense, it is altering their behavior. I mean, they come to the Bagans every morning, and you can see there's frequently lots of, minor cuts on their face because they're rubbing against the Bagans. Those cuts, I might add, heal incredibly quickly in whale sharks. I'm always amazed at how fast they heal. We're with certain shark for over 5 days, and you see them get cut and heal and cut and heal and cut and heal repeatedly. But yeah, is that a good thing? I don't think it's a great thing, but at the same time, what we see from our whale shark tracks, from the satellite tracks, these animals are still going on long distance trips when they feel like it, and others stay there all year round. And, you could argue that the ones that are staying there all year round are doing it because of the Bagans, maybe. But there's plenty which don't, and they go out. So I tend to think that they, you know, that if you, again, you talk to the local fishermen there, before the Bagans were ever there, those whale sharks were busy feeding on the bait fish. And so they're still trying to feed on the bait fish, and some of them are being thrown back to them, others they're catching on their own. So sorry, it was a long-winded answer, Simon, but
No, no, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. It's not an easy one to answer because of course it's a double-sided sword. Without all the tourism dollars, would
yeah,
the governments, the local governments, be interested in setting up MPAs, for example? It's
yeah,
kind of like if as long as it's not like a mess like in Oslo,
yeah.
and the whale sharks do not aggregate there only, I think
Mm.
there's also lots of positives about that tourism anyway. But I think it's a great idea to just do a natural aggregation. Then it's not hand fed. They still have to go and suck in the fish that are swimming away from them, and then
Yep.
it would be totally natural. I think that's a fabulous idea. Um, Let me just see. Not gonna be able to ask all the questions, guys, but I am gonna ask this one. Um, would you say that there are patterns of migrations that are as a species recognizable? I know that we have some like things like the one in Mexico where you have lots and lots of whale sharks coming together. It's not really like that in Asia. So are you seeing at all any patterns for the species, or is it really mostly individuals?
Well, again, what I would say is that, you know, it is a little bit different what we're seeing in the sense that well, certainly in Saleh Bay and in CENDERAWASIH Bay, what's unique about them is that those aggregations are year round. So you can see whale sharks there any month of the year, they are there. And again, we think that's because it's a food source thing. Their food source that they're predominantly focused on in this case is bait fish, and those bait fish are there all the time. If you look at all the other areas where they are aggregating, such as Isla Mujeres or Ningaloo or Belize, etc., those are specific, what we would say, ephemeral food sources, which are only there for a short period of time. So in Belize, you know, it's this big snapper spawning aggregation site. The snapper come to spawn, the whale sharks show up to feed on the spawn. When the snappers go away, the whale sharks go away. If you go to Isla Mujeres, which is the biggest of all the aggregations in the world for whale sharks off of Mexico, that one, it's like it's a kind of a bonito or an albacore tuna that's spawning there, and that's what they're feeding on is again the eggs of that. But again, that's a very ephemeral source, and then it goes away. In the case of these bait fish schools, they're there year round, and so why would you as a shark leave when the food is there? But what we do see is some of these unique departures for a period of time. I showed you that with the Saleh Bay ones, we're seeing that a large number of the sharks do go down across the Java Trench towards Australia and seem to be feeding for a 4-month period or so on southern bluefin tuna spawn. That's our hypothesis, at least, and a similar thing out of Triton Bay down into the Arafura Sea. So we definitely see some patterns, but they're a bit messy, and different animals have their own ideas about what they're going to do.
Well, I think there's still so much left to learn, which is really exciting. So, it's great that we still have these mysteries. Although they're so big, these animals, we still are learning, and you're making that possible. So I think that's really amazing. I know we're at 1 hour and it's late for you, but me personally, I'd love to hear a little bit about the walking shark because I think there's a lot of resources on whale sharks. There's maybe limited resources on walking sharks. So
Sure.
for everybody, we're now at 1 hour. Just so you know, for Mark, it's really late, but he still said he would show a couple things about the walking shark. So it's up to you if you want to listen in. But the walking shark's one of my, well, I have many favorite animals. This is definitely one of them. And Mark's an expert, so he's going to show us a couple of things. I'm
All
getting
right.
some yeses there in the chat. So
Okay, well, that's
I
good to know.
suppose if you can still master it time-wise, I
I
think we
think I
have
can. I'm just going to see if I can switch to this. So I've got to get rid of that one. Don't Save, okay. Hopefully I can get to my walking shark one here. Is it here? Failed to start. Let me. Okay, there it is. Okay. There we go. All right, are you seeing that now?
Yeah, excited.
All right, cool. So I will give you a bit of an introduction to walking sharks and speed through this. Walking sharks, also known as epaulet sharks, are members of the genus Hemicillium in the family Hemicilliidae. They are closely related to the bamboo sharks in Chilocillium, which you can see a couple of them there. And the big difference really between the walking sharks or epaulet sharks and the bamboo sharks is really just the barbels on the nose, the mouth there. In a walking shark, they're terminal, whereas in the bamboo sharks, they're subterminal, which is, I know, a rather arcane difference, but it's definitely there. Both of them do lay eggs.
Sorry, what does that mean? Sorry, what does that mean, terminal?
So if you can see on the left-hand side there, the barbels, the little things coming out of the nose, so to speak, are at the end of the snout on a walking shark, whereas on the right-hand side, you've got a bamboo shark, and you can see the barbels are a little bit back on the mouth, if you can see that, so that we call it terminal. Again, a minor difference, but what it's really one of the few morphological things which is different about them. They both lay eggs, but the interesting thing is that Chilocillium has a much broader distribution, and I'll get to that in a minute, but Chilocillium is kind of found across the Indo-West Pacific, whereas the Hemicillium, the walking sharks, as it turns out, are only around the island of New Guinea and a few satellite islands like Aru and Halmahera. So the walking sharks are typically quite small. Most of them don't reach beyond 75 centimeters in length, occasionally upwards to 90 centimeters, but mostly smaller than that. And they're nocturnally active, and they come out and they walk around on the reef searching for their prey items, which are mostly crabs and shrimps and a few mollusks and clams and so forth, and occasionally on small fish. And I'll just show you, if you don't believe that sharks walk, here's a video of one doing it, and you can see they're really like a gecko in a lot of ways. They're moving across the bottom, and they do this really in order to be able to search for food under coral heads. So instead of being like a normal shark, which is feeding, of course, mid-water column, they would poke their head under something like that and look for something to eat. So that's what's going on there. So again, they have a short snout. They have eyes on the side and these nasal barbels, as I said, right on the end in a terminal position. They do have two dorsal fins, roughly equal sized, and placed quite far back on the body. And then they have these pectoral and pelvic fins, which are about the same size, paired, which they use to walk across the bottom. We now know that there are at least 9 species of walking shark around New Guinea and Australia and onto the satellite islands of Aru and Halmahera. But if we look back only a decade ago, our understanding was actually very different. So the first walking shark to be discovered was actually part of Captain Cook's great expedition and along the Great Barrier Reef in the Endeavour River. His ship was wrecked in the 1700s, and while it was wrecked and they were rebuilding it or fixing it, they discovered the first walking shark back at that time. The second walking shark was found in the early 1800s, again, another major European expedition, this one a French one, the Uranie. And they visited Raja Ampat, and you can see there, if you've ever been to Raja Ampat, that is their artist rendition of what Wayag looked like back in the 1800s. Quite interesting. And they named the second walking shark, Hemicillium freycineti, named after the captain of the Uranie. That was back in 1824. And in fact, just out of curiosity, that is the original Raja Ampat walking shark from the Paris Museum, preserved in some sort of alcohol 200 years on. So you can see those specimens do last when they're alcohol preserved. Now, there were a few papers that were done on the walking sharks back in the 70s and 80s. And what we knew of them at that time, and this went all the way through to the 2000s, is that we had those two main species, the Great Barrier Reef species and the Rajempat species, and we thought that they were found everywhere. We thought that the Great Barrier Reef one was found all the way around Australia, up into New Guinea, up into West Papua, and you see even on the left-hand side there some light pink around Malaysia, Singapore, and Kalimantan, where they've been reported. And then the Rajempat one was also thought to be all around the island of New Guinea. Now, that was challenged when we started doing surveys in 2006 around West Papua. And we actually found that the Rajempat walking shark was only found in Rajempat. And if you went just a little bit to the south, there was a new species that was found in Fakfak and Kaimana. And if you went just a little bit to the east, there was a new species that was found in CENDERAWASIH Bay. So very quickly, we got to a situation of having 3 species around the bird's head of West Papua, and you know, very small ranges for each of those. So we had to start questioning if those distributions were actually true. And indeed, what we now know is that there are actually 9 species, and each one of them has a very restricted distribution. So that's the Rajempat one. It's literally endemic to Rajempat only. There is the one which was found in CENDERAWASIH. This one across the northern bit of New Guinea, a beautiful animal, Hemicillium strahani. This one only known from Milne Bay in Papua New Guinea, probably the prettiest of all the walking sharks. Hallströmi is southern Papua New Guinea and into the Torres Strait. Pretty animal as well. There's the one which is found on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, the original walking shark. Hemicillium trispecularis has probably the biggest distribution. It's really from Ningaloo in Western Australia up to Darwin, up into the Gulf of Carpentaria, and all the way to Aru in Indonesia, actually. Then there's Hemicillium henryi, which is just really Fakfak and Kaimana. Hemicillium halmahera, which is actually we now know to be all the way around Halmahera. So if you add those all together, you have these 9 species that basically form an interesting ring around the island of New Guinea, onto the north coast of Australia, and out onto Aru and Halmahera. So pretty interesting type of situation. This is very unique, I might add, for sharks. You know, if you think about a black tip reef shark, it's found from the east coast of Africa all the way to the coast of the Americas. Whale sharks are found circumglobally everywhere. Same with, you know, white sharks and things. But here's some sharks which have these tiny little distributions only in, you know, little areas of New Guinea, really.
And they don't overlap, yeah? You don't find 2 in the same area.
No overlapping at all. So we have this question, you know, why do they have such restricted distributions? And the answer there really seems to be in their unique reproductive biology. So they do lay eggs, and they have an embryo. You can see there at the bottom what a tiny juvenile looks like when it hatches out. And when they hatch, they don't move really very far at all. They're basically on the same reef where their parents laid them, and they really don't move very much. So the idea is that these animals have almost no real dispersal capability, and, you know, obviously they had to have dispersed at one time in order for us to get these 9 different species, but those were probably each, you know, individual you know, chance activities, maybe storms that blew them or whatever might have happened, and that's kind of interesting. So I would note that we've recently done a big genetic study on them, and what we've shown is that these walking sharks are the newest branch of the shark family tree. And I'm not going to try to explain this in too much detail, but, you know, sharks in general have been around for hundreds of millions of years. But the walking sharks only branched off from the bamboo sharks about 9 million years ago. And the most recent split was between the Rajempat and the CENDERAWASIH shark, and using genetic dating, that was only about 2 million years ago, which still sounds like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, these are basically a brand new set of sharks, which is a pretty cool little thing there. And that's the paper which described that. So again, there are the 9 known species, but I put in 4 question marks for some areas where we have big questions about, is there potentially 4 other new species that are in those kind of areas where we don't know what's there. Of course, most of those areas are pretty remote, hard to get to areas. Some of them are very full of mangroves and tidal mudflats, perhaps not the most, well, they certainly have plenty of crocodiles. I don't know if they have walking sharks or not, but there's a big question mark about that. And so I think with that, I'll say thank you very much. And there you go.
Very cool. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I just love these guys. They're just so funny. And I was unlucky. We were in Kaimana. We looked for them. And then the last day, so we were leaving the next morning, we couldn't dive anymore because, you know, the next day we were flying. And that night dive, they had like a really long walking shark interaction where they were filming it. And yeah, that was unfortunate. I've seen them a really long time ago on the Great Barrier Reef, the one that's there. But I was so fresh in diving, I had no idea what I was really looking at. So thank you very much for that. I know you did that one for me, so I appreciate it. But I can see that lots of people are very happy about that because it is a very cool shark. And I think although, you know, they're so different in size, they are sort of still both bottom sharks because the whale shark originally is kind of a carpet shark, right? So there is a link that justified, I think, this connection.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for also staying and listening to the bonus. Did you want to show some links or anything for? Otherwise, I can send them via email to people.
Yeah, I think that's probably best. As I said, I'm kind of a retro grouch when it comes to social media, so I'm not much of a linker. But anyway,
I can send some more information to everybody. I just wanted to point out, guys, next week, I know this is a bit different, but next week, do chime in. Same time, just 2 hours later, is Alan Walker is going to talk about sharks of South Africa and a lot of photography. So lots of exciting stuff, including a whale carcass where tiger sharks and great whites are feeding on at the same time. So really, really exciting. And these crazy South Africans jump in and take the photos, free diving between the great whites. So that's going to be next week. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that we've been trying to organize. You keep trying to organize these. If you want to support our work, you can go onto this donate one, or I will send a link where you can donate to Conservation International if you'd like to support the work. We heard how expensive these tags are, so you can donate to Conservation International. And can you donate directly to your whale shark research? Is that possible?
Yep, absolutely. Definitely. And we have people who sponsor individual tags if they want to, and then they get to name the animal. So yeah.
Oh, well, if anybody would like that, I think that would be pretty cool. Next time we do this talk in a couple of years, we can be like, this is so-and-so's shark. That would be pretty cool. Finally, if you want to follow us on Insider Divers on any of the social media things that Mark doesn't do, please do so. And with that, I would like to say thank you again for your time. And it was a fabulous talk. Learned a lot again. And yeah, wishing everybody a great time and stay safe.
Okay. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye, Mark. Bye, everybody.